there is a version of you that exists in other people's minds. It is made of impressions, of fragments, the way you behaved in a specific moment under specific pressure, the expression that crossed your face when you heard a certain kind of news, the thing you said at a dinner table 5 years ago that someone has never quite forgotten. Other people carry this version of you everywhere. They update it occasionally when you do something that surprises them, but mostly they hold it still. They have a model of who you are, and they use it to predict what you'll do next. What's strange is that you have the same thing. You have a model of yourself, a sense of who you are, what you're like, what you do and don't do. You use it too, constantly, to explain your own behavior, to make decisions, to understand why you felt one way rather than another in a given situation. You think of yourself as a consistent person, a recognizable person, a person with a character that holds across time. Both models are real, and both models are, to varying degrees, wrong. The science of personality is, in a certain way, the science of those two gaps, the gap between who you think you are and who you actually are, and the gap between who other people think you are and who you actually are. It is also the science of what is stable and what isn't, of what you were born carrying and what you assembled along the way, of how much of who you are was decided before you had any say in the matter. Tonight, we're going to take that apart slowly, not to make you feel uncertain about yourself, though you might, a little by the end, but because the science of personality is one of the most quietly astonishing bodies of research in all of psychology. What it has found is stranger and more nuanced than most people expect, and it changes, in a subtle but lasting way, how you see yourself in the dark, when no one is watching and you are exactly who you are. Target 1,500 plus words. For most of the 20th century, the study of personality was a mess. Not because researchers weren't trying. They were trying very hard. The problem was that everyone was working from a different starting point, different theories, different vocabulary, different ideas about what personality even was. Some psychologists thought personality was rooted in unconscious drives. Others thought it was entirely the product of environment and conditioning. Others built elaborate typologies, personalities sorted into categories, like the compartments of a drawer. The field produced a proliferation of frameworks, each claiming to capture something essential about human character, none of them quite compatible with the others. The breakthrough came from a deceptively simple idea. If personality is real, if there is something consistent about how people behave across situations, then that consistency should show up in language. Because language is how humans have always described one another. Across thousands of years and hundreds of cultures, people have needed words for what their neighbors are like. And if the same qualities kept mattering, if some dimensions of human behavior kept proving relevant enough to name, then those dimensions should be recoverable from a language itself. In the 1930s, Gordon Allport and Henry Odbert went through an English dictionary and pulled out every word that could be used to describe a stable personality trait. They found roughly 18,000 of them. That number is itself a fact worth sitting with. 18,000 words for what people are like. It is a remarkable testimony to how much attention humans pay to one another, how closely we watch, how carefully we sort. The lexical hypothesis. The idea that the most important dimensions of personality would be reflected in the most commonly used words became the engine of a long empirical project. Researchers took those thousands of trait words and asked, which ones cluster? Which ones go together? If someone is described as talkative, do people also tend to describe them as outgoing, assertive, energetic? If someone is described as anxious, are they also described as moody, tense, easily upset? Through statistical techniques that could identify patterns across thousands of ratings, a structure began to emerge. By the late 20th century, a consensus had formed around 5 broad dimensions, 5 factors, 5 ways that human personality varies that seemed robust across studies, across cultures, across raters. You might know them by the acronym OCEAN: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. But describing them by name doesn't quite capture what each one means and what it feels like to be at different points along each dimension. Openness is the one that most people find hardest to place. It's not just curiosity, though curiosity is part of it. It's a kind of permeability to experience, a tendency to engage with ideas, images, sensations, possibilities, rather than filtering them out. People high in openness tend to have vivid inner lives. They are drawn to abstraction, to art, to novelty, to complexity. They are comfortable with ambiguity in a way that people lower in openness often are not. People lower in openness tend to prefer the concrete, the familiar, the practical. They are not less intelligent. Openness correlates only modestly with measured intelligence, but they move through the world differently, less drawn to the new, more anchored in the known. Conscientiousness is easier to recognize. It is the dimension that tracks self-discipline, reliability, goal-directedness, organization. People high in conscientiousness tend to follow through. They make plans and they keep them. They are on time, they meet deadlines, they return calls. People low in conscientiousness tend to be more impulsive, more spontaneous, less organized, not through any failure of character, but through a genuinely different relationship to self-regulation. Conscientiousness, research has found, is one of the strongest predictors of life outcomes. Academic performance, career success, health behaviors, relationship stability. Not because conscientious people are morally superior, but because the ability to delay gratification and follow through on intentions turns out to matter enormously across nearly every domain of life. Extroversion is the one people think they understand, and they mostly do, but they miss a key piece. Extroversion is not simply sociability. It is a broader orientation toward positive reward, toward seeking stimulation from the external world. Extroverts are drawn toward social situations, toward activity, toward noise and novelty and company, partly because these things activate their reward systems more readily. Introverts are not antisocial or unfriendly. They simply have lower thresholds for stimulation and often find the same social situations that energize an extrovert mildly draining. The introvert is not missing something. They are calibrated differently. Agreeableness tracks the tendency toward cooperation, trust, and prosocial behavior. People high in agreeableness tend to be warm, to give others the benefit of the doubt, to avoid conflict, to prioritize harmony. People low in agreeableness tend to be more competitive, more skeptical, more willing to assert their interests at the expense of others. Neither extreme is simply good or bad. High agreeableness can shade into conflict avoidance and susceptibility to exploitation. Low agreeableness can shade into ruthlessness, but also into an admirable unwillingness to be pushed around. And neuroticism, which is sometimes called emotional instability or negative emotionality, is the tendency to experience negative emotions frequently and intensely. People high in neuroticism tend to react more strongly to stress, to experience more anxiety, more irritability, more sadness in response to the same events that people low in neuroticism move through more calmly. It is worth being very clear that neuroticism is not a character flaw. It is a trait, a genuine and heritable dimension of human variation. People high in neuroticism are not failing at something that comes easily to others. Their nervous systems are simply more sensitive to threat and frustration. That sensitivity has costs. It also has benefits that are less often discussed. What makes the Big Five genuinely important is not just that it organized the field. It's that the structure keeps reappearing. Researchers have translated personality questionnaires into dozens of languages, administered them to samples from dozens of cultures, including cultures far outside the Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic contexts that dominate psychological research. And the same 5 factors keep emerging. Not perfectly. The structure is somewhat less clear in some cultures than others, but the basic shape keeps returning. Something about human personality appears to have a structure that is not culturally constructed, but that runs deeper into biology, into the architecture of the nervous system itself. That discovery, that personality has a structure, and that the structure is at least partly universal, is the foundation that everything else rests on. But the 5 factors are not just an academic organizing scheme. They are a description of something you live inside every day. The particular combination of these dimensions that characterizes you, your specific position on each of the 5 continuums, produces a particular texture of experience that is yours and no one else's. The way mornings feel, the kinds of conversations that drain you and the kinds that restore you, the situations that trigger your strongest reactions. the domains where effort comes easily, and the domains where it always feels like swimming against a current. All of that is, in some significant measure, the 5 factors expressing themselves in the specific conditions of your life. Neuroticism is perhaps the most important of the 5 for understanding lived experience, and also the most misunderstood. People who score high in neuroticism, who live in nervous systems that are more reactive, more sensitive to threat and disappointment, often carry a private shame about this fact. They know they react more strongly than other people seem to. They notice that the same event that sends them spiraling leaves someone else unruffled, and they tend to interpret this difference as a failure, as evidence that they are not coping well, not managing well, not as competent or resilient as they should be. The research offers a different interpretation. High neuroticism is not a coping failure. It is a trait, a genuine dimension of human variation with a heritable component, a biological basis, and a long history of being present in human populations because it is not uniformly disadvantageous. The person who notices the threat before anyone else does, who sounds the alarm when the alarm needs sounding, who cannot let a problem rest until it is resolved. That person's neuroticism is doing something. It is expensive. It costs energy and sleep and sometimes relationships. But it is not simply a malfunction. What the Big 5 gives you, if you use it honestly, is a set of terms that are more precise and less morally loaded than the ones people usually use to describe themselves. Instead of "I am bad at social situations," which implies a deficit, the framework offers, "You are lower in extroversion," which means you have a lower threshold for social stimulation than some people. Instead of "I am irresponsible," which implies a character flaw, you are lower in conscientiousness, which means self-regulation requires more deliberate effort for you than for people who are higher in that trait. The framework doesn't excuse, it describes. And description, done clearly and honestly, is the beginning of working with something rather than against it. There's also something worth knowing about the distributions of these traits. Each of the 5 factors follows a rough bell curve across the population. Most people cluster near the middle of each dimension, with fewer people at the extremes, which means that the person who seems strikingly extroverted, or strikingly conscientious, or strikingly neurotic is not representative of most people. Most people are moderate on most traits. Most people contain more than one tendency, more than one pull, toward both engagement and retreat, toward both spontaneity and self-discipline, toward both trust and skepticism. The felt experience of having a personality is usually the experience of managing competing poles, not of embodying a single pure type. That ambivalence, that sense of being sometimes one thing and sometimes another. The research says it is not confusion about who you are. It is who you are. Target 1,500 plus words. There is a study that many personality researchers consider one of the most important in the history of their field. It is not elegant or surprising in its design. It is, on the face of it, a simple comparison. But what it found has echoes in almost every subsequent decade of research. The Minnesota study of twins reared apart began in 1979 under the direction of Thomas Bouchard at the University of Minnesota. The idea was straightforward. Find twins who were separated at birth and raised in different families, and measure them as adults. If personality is primarily shaped by environment, by parenting, by culture, by the circumstances of upbringing, then twins raised apart should be no more similar in personality than any two strangers. If personality has a strong genetic component, then twins raised apart should still resemble one another. The twins who came to Minneapolis over the years that followed were often meeting each other for the first time. Some were identical twins, some fraternal. Many had been adopted in infancy into families they had no reason to believe held a biological copy of themselves. What the researchers found, when they measured personality across every dimension they could assess, was something that stopped a lot of people in their tracks. Identical twins raised apart were nearly as similar in personality as identical twins raised together. Let that settle for a moment. Two people who shared the same DNA, who were separated in infancy and raised in completely different homes by completely different families in completely different contexts. They came out as adults, measurably similar in their extroversion, their agreeableness, their conscientiousness, their emotional stability, their openness to experience. The environment they were raised in, which is everything we normally think of as the shaping force, accounted for surprisingly little of who they turned out to be. Behavioral genetics research has continued to refine these estimates over the decades since Bouchard's study. The current consensus across hundreds of twin and adoption studies is that somewhere between 40 and 60% of the variation in Big Five personality traits can be attributed to genetic factors. The exact number varies somewhat by trait and by study, but the general finding is stable. Roughly half of who you are, in terms of personality, was there in your genes before you were born. This finding has been widely misunderstood. It does not mean that environment doesn't matter. It does not mean that people can't change. It does not mean that your personality was fixed at conception. What it means is something more specific and, in its way, more interesting. The environments people grow up in have less influence on personality than we typically assume, and the variation that does exist between people in personality traits is substantially driven by differences in their biology. The piece that often surprises people the most is what the behavioral genetics research says about the family environment specifically. You might expect that children who grow up in the same family would end up more similar. That shared dinners, shared parents, shared schools, shared neighborhood would make them converge. The data suggests otherwise. Twins raised in the same home are not appreciably more similar in personality than twins raised apart, once you control for their genetic similarity. What this implies is that the shared family environment, the parenting style, the household rules, the cultural norms of the home, has relatively little lasting impact on personality compared to what people generally assume. What does influence personality from the environment side are factors that are not shared by siblings in the same family. Peer groups, random developmental experiences, the particular microenvironments that each child inhabits within the same household, biological events like infections or accidents or hormonal fluctuations. These non-shared environmental influences are where most of the environmental effect on personality resides, which means that two children who grow up in the same house, under the same parents, eating the same dinners, going to the same schools, they are being shaped by mostly different environments in the ways that actually matter for personality. They are having, in a deep sense, completely different childhoods. This finding can feel unsettling if you are a parent, or if you have spent a lot of time thinking about how your own upbringing shaped you. It does not mean that parenting doesn't matter. It matters enormously for outcomes like values, attitudes, educational attainment, relationship quality. It means that the specific dimension of personality, the kind of person your nervous system makes you, is less the product of what happened in your household than people tend to believe. There is a particular way this finding lands for people who have spent years trying to understand the relationship between their childhood and their adult selves. The project of connecting what happened then to who you are now is a real and valuable project. It is not made obsolete by the behavioral genetics data. What the data complicates is the implicit assumption that the causal arrows all run in one direction, that the environment made you this way, that if your childhood had been different, you would be fundamentally different, that the personality you carry is primarily the product of what was done to or withheld from you. The genetics data suggests the story is more complicated than that. Some of what you are now, you would have been anyway. You are going to have that particular relationship to anxiety, or that particular pull towards solitude, or that particular impatience with disorder, regardless of what your parents did. The environment shaped how those tendencies were expressed and interpreted, and what meaning was attached to them. But the tendencies themselves were, in significant measure, already there. This is worth sitting with, especially if you have constructed a long causal story about why you are the way you are. Some of that story is true. Some of the connection between past events and present traits is real. But some of what you have attributed to experience was simply temperament, was there before the experiences you remember expressed itself in the experiences, was interpreted through the lens of those experiences, and would have found its way out regardless. Separating these threads is genuinely difficult, and perhaps not always necessary. But knowing the threads are there distinct is useful. You did not choose your baseline level of extroversion. You did not choose how reactive your nervous system is to stress, or how easily you are drawn toward novelty, or how strong your pull toward cooperation and harmony is. These things were given to you, in large part, before your life began in any meaningful sense. They are yours now, as much as any part of you is yours. But they did not come from anything you did, or anything your parents did, or anything the world did to you. They came from somewhere earlier and deeper than any of that. There's something that people find both troubling and oddly liberating about this. Troubling because it challenges the idea that we are primarily made by our experiences, that we are the authors of our own character. Liberating because it reframes the parts of yourself that have always been hardest to change. The anxiety, the shyness, the restlessness, not as failures of effort or failures of your upbringing, but as traits, features of your biology that you are working with, not defects to overcome. The reframe matters in a specific way. When you believe that the anxiety you carry is a product of things that went wrong, that if those things hadn't happened, you would be a calmer person, the anxiety feels like an injury. It carries the weight of grievance and loss. What could have been, who you might have been otherwise. That framing is painful, and it makes the anxiety harder to live with, because it is joined by a story of unfairness, of something having been taken. When you hold the anxiety as a trait, as something that was likely to be yours regardless of what happened, as a feature of how your nervous system is calibrated, the quality of the relationship to it shifts, not immediately, and not without resistance. The grief about it may still be real. The difficulty of living in a more reactive nervous system is real. But the anxiety becomes yours in a different sense. Not something done to you. Something you are working with. The way you work with the fact of being tall or short or left-handed. Not chosen, but not an injury either. Just a feature of the particular nervous system you are occupying. That reframe, from wound to trait, is one of the more useful gifts that personality research has to offer people who spend a lot of time trying to understand why they are the way they are. Target 1,500 plus words. One of the oldest questions in personality psychology is also one of the most personal. Do people really change? Not the superficial kind of change, the way you learn to navigate social situations more smoothly as you age, the way trauma or therapy can shift specific behaviors, the way you accumulate experiences that alter what you know and believe. The deeper question, does the underlying architecture of your personality, the big five, the heritable structure, change over a lifetime? Is the person you are at 40 recognizably the same person you were at 20, at 10, at 5? The answer, as with most genuinely interesting questions in psychology, is yes and no, and the proportion shifts in ways that matter. The longitudinal research on personality stability spans decades. Researchers have followed the same people across 30, 40, even 50 years of their lives, measuring personality at multiple points and asking what stayed the same and what moved. The findings have a consistent shape. In childhood and adolescence, personality is relatively fluid. The big 5 traits are present and measurable in young children, but they are also more variable than they will be later. Temperament, the biological raw material from which personality is built, shows up early, sometimes very early. Parents recognize differences in their children's reactivity, their sociability, their persistence from the first months of life. But the personality that emerges in adulthood is not a direct, linear descendant of these early traits. The path from infant temperament to adult personality runs through a long developmental process that is genuinely shaping, not just revealing. The most substantial personality change in the research happens between the late teens and the mid-20s. The period researchers have come to call emerging adulthood is, it turns out, also the period of maximum personality flux. People who were high in neuroticism in their teens often show meaningful decreases by their late 20s. Extroversion tends to decrease slightly. Conscientiousness and agreeableness tend to increase, a pattern so reliable across cultures and samples that researchers have given it a name, the maturity principle. People, on average, become more responsible, more warm, and more emotionally stable as they move from youth into adulthood. Not because they work at it, necessarily. It appears to be partly a developmental process, something that happens to the personality in roughly the same way that a bone finishes calcifying. After the mid-20s, the rate of personality change slows substantially. Personality does not freeze. The research does not support the old idea that character is fully set by 30. Change continues throughout life, but the changes become smaller and slower. The person you are at 25 is not identical to the person you will be at 55, but you would be recognizable to your younger self. The structure is stable. What this means in practice is worth sitting with. If you have ever found yourself frustrated by some aspect of your personality, the way you react under stress, the difficulty you have with certain social situations, the recurring pattern of thoughts that shows up in the same circumstances, it is useful to know that you are probably not fighting something that is going to disappear if you try hard enough. You may be fighting something structural, something that can be worked with, adapted to, managed. But that is likely to remain in its basic form, a feature of how your nervous system operates. This is not a counsel of despair. The research on personality change also shows that change is possible, and that it sometimes happens in response to specific life events: marriage, parenthood, sustained therapy, demanding work roles, long-term relationships. Not always, and not on demand. But the personality is not a concrete wall. It is more like a river. It has a direction, a momentum, a characteristic way of moving. The banks can be shaped, the course can be altered, but the water keeps flowing. There's one finding in the stability literature that people find particularly striking. Studies of personality across the full lifespan, from young adulthood into old age, find that personality continues to change in consistent ways across most of adult life. Neuroticism tends to decrease. Agreeableness continues to increase. Conscientiousness peaks in middle age and then begins a modest decline in later life. What the research portrait of personality across a lifespan shows is not a fixed character, carved in stone at some early age. It shows a slow, mostly predictable arc, a kind of narrative that most people's personalities move through, shaped by time and experience, but moving in a direction that is recognizable across very different lives. The person you will be at 70 is probably somewhat calmer than the person you are now, somewhat warmer. The edges, research suggests, tend to soften with time for most people in most dimensions. Not because of anything specific that happens, not because of any deliberate effort, but because that is the direction the human personality tends to move across a life. That is, perhaps, a small comfort at 2 in the morning. The maturity principle, the finding that people, on average, become more conscientious, more agreeable, and less neurotic as they age, is one of those findings that is easy to read as reassuring, but harder to feel in the present tense. If you are someone who is currently high in neuroticism, or low in conscientiousness, or struggling with the parts of your personality that have always been the hardest to live in, the data that things tend to improve over time can feel distant. The improvement happens on a timescale that is very long relative to the experience of a difficult week. What is worth saying is that the maturity principle is a population trend, not a guarantee. It describes what happens on average across large samples. For any individual, the trajectory varies. Some people show dramatic decreases in neuroticism across adulthood. Others show relatively little change. The underlying forces that drive the trend, developmental processes, social roles, relationship demands, accumulated experience, operate differently for different people. The trend is real, but it is not a prescription. What the research does suggest is that the personality is not static. The mistake is expecting it to change the way you would expect a decision to change quickly, in response to intention and will. Personality changes the way a landscape changes, slowly, in response to forces that operate continuously, and mostly beneath the level of conscious awareness. Years of a demanding career role that requires conscientiousness can raise your measured conscientiousness. A long marriage to a warm and agreeable partner can shift your own agreeableness. Years of practicing a kind of deliberate emotional regulation, not forcing yourself to feel different, but practicing the behavioral responses that regulated people make, can, over long enough timescales, alter the trait measures. The changes are real. They are just slower than most people expect, and they happen more through living than through resolving. The specific finding that personality becomes most stable in middle adulthood, and then loosens slightly again in later life has an interesting implication for how you might understand whichever stage of life you are currently in. If you are in your 20s or early 30s, you are still in the most fluid period. The person you are right now is not the person you will be at 40, and not only in terms of external circumstances. The underlying structure of your personality is still measurably in process. The commitments you make, the roles you take on, the relationships you invest in, the demands you choose to meet, are very likely still actively shaping you in ways that feel like simply growing up, but that show up in the trait data as genuine personality chain. If you are past that period, in the more stable decades, the picture is different. The traits are more set, more predictable, more consistent across situations. This is not a loss. The stability that comes with a more settled personality has real advantages. Relationships become easier when your behavior is more predictable. Work becomes more efficient when your habits of mind are reliable. The internal negotiation required by every decision becomes less exhausting when your values and preferences are clearer and more settled. The cost of stability is some loss of plasticity. The benefit is some gain in knowing who you are. The research on personality stability across the lifespan also contains one finding that people find unexpectedly moving. In very old age, past 80, past 90, the personality begins to soften in its characteristic ways. Not always, and not uniformly, but the rigid aspects of personality, the defended positions, the long-held emotional stances, tend to release somewhat. The most difficult parts of people, the chronic criticism, the sustained anger, the defenses that served a function earlier, often become less prominent. What remains tends to be something closer to core character, stripped of its defensive layering. People who worked with the dying have often noted this, that people at the very end of their lives are often the most clearly themselves. The essential person without the accretion of years of compensations and strategies. The person you will become at the end, the research suggests, may be something like the clearest version of what you always were. Target 1,500 plus words. There is a psychologist named Dan McAdams who has spent decades arguing that personality is not just a set of traits. Traits, he says, are real. The Big Five captures something genuine and important about human character. But they are, in a sense, the surface of the story. Below them, or alongside them, is something else, the narrative. McAdams calls it the personal narrative, or the narrative identity, the story you have constructed about who you are, where you came from, and what your life means. It is not just a collection of memories. It is an organized, interpreted account of your own life, one that has a protagonist, you, a set of recurring themes, the struggles you keep encountering, the values that keep showing up, and an implicit sense of how the story is supposed to go. It is the running explanation you give yourself for why you are the way you are. Most people are not consciously aware that they are telling this story. It feels less like a narrative and more like simply knowing yourself. But the research McAdams and his colleagues have done over decades of interviewing people about their lives makes the narrative structure very visible. Ask someone to tell you about their life, not a biographical summary, but a story, the story, and patterns emerge. High points and low points. Turning points, the moments people identify as having changed the direction of their lives. Scenes that they return to again and again that seem to carry a particular weight. Contamination sequences, stories that start well and turn bad, and redemption sequences, stories that start badly and turn toward meaning or growth. What people tell and how they tell it, McAdams has found, says something consistent about them. People who narrate their life stories with frequent redemption sequences, who tend to remember the difficult parts of their lives as having led somewhere, as having produced growth or wisdom or strength. These people show consistently higher levels of well-being, better psychological health, stronger senses of purpose. The interpretation, the meaning-making, is not separate from the personality. It is part of it. This is where something gets interesting. You have traits, the heritable, stable dimensions of the Big Five. You have narrative identity, the story you've constructed about what those traits mean, where they came from, what they've led to. And the relationship between these two things is not one way. The traits shape the narrative, obviously. Someone high in neuroticism will tend to tell a story with more threat, more struggle, more emotional turbulence than someone low in neuroticism, even if the external events of their lives were similar. But the narrative also shapes, over time, how the traits express. The story you tell about your anxiety, or your introversion, or your sensitivity, whether you tell it as a burden or as a feature, as a problem to be solved, or as a form of depth, matters, not in a simple or magical way, but in the sense that the meaning you assign to your traits influences how you relate to them, and how you relate to them influences how they unfold in your life. There is a particular kind of scene that McAdams has identified as especially important in life narratives, the self-defining memory. These are memories that people feel are particularly revealing of who they are, not necessarily the most dramatic memories, not always the most recent, but the ones that feel most characteristic, most explanatory. People carry a small set of these and return to them, rehearse them, use them as mirrors. When you want to explain yourself to someone or to yourself, you reach for one of these scenes. What is worth knowing is that these self-defining memories are not neutral records of what happened. They are constructions. They have been shaped and reshaped by the act of remembering them, by the interpretive frame you brought to them at the time and have brought to them since. The memory you carry of a difficult parent, a moment of failure, a sudden unexpected kindness. These are not photographs. They are more like paintings that have been repainted many times, that carry traces of every version of yourself who has looked at them and added something. This does not mean they are false. It means they are alive, they are still doing work, they are still contributing to the story. And because they are still doing work, they are still somewhat open to interpretation. Not endlessly, some things happened, and they happened in ways that left marks that don't simply rewrite. But the frame through which you hold the memory, the meaning you assign to it, the role you give it in the narrative of your life, that is not fixed. That can shift, often does shift, sometimes quite dramatically, in the course of a good therapy or a long friendship, or simply the accumulating perspective of years. The person you think you are is, in part, the story you have told about the experiences you have had. And the story, while it has a real foundation, is also a construction. It was assembled. It can be reassembled differently if the right conditions arise. The narrative identity is not a passive record. It is an active process. You are not simply recalling your life. You are continuously revising it, selecting which events to feature and which to minimize, which interpretations to hold and which to slowly release. This happens largely without awareness. The editing is constant. What you will remember about this week in 5 years is not determined yet. It will be shaped by what happens between now and then, by what you need the story of this week to mean in the context of the story of your life at that later point. The narrative is still open. McAdams has found something that he describes as the distinction between the life story as told and the life story as lived. The lived life is the sequence of events in all their ambiguity and complexity and contradiction. The told life is the version that has been organized, selected, and interpreted. Most people experience only the told version. It is the version that feels like memory. But the gap between the two is where the most useful self-knowledge lies. The events that got edited out, the interpretations that could have been different, the turning points that were recognized as such only in retrospect, and might have been recognized differently if the retrospect had come later or earlier. The specific memories you return to most often, the ones that feel most definitional, most revelatory of who you are worth examining, not for their factual accuracy, but for their emotional logic. What do they say you are? What recurring theme do they reinforce? People who carry a set of self-defining memories that are predominantly about failure or betrayal or loss carry a different sense of self than people whose self-defining memories are predominantly about overcoming or connection or unexpected grace. Neither set of memories is necessarily more accurate. They are both selections from a much larger archive. The question is not whether the memories are true, but what they are being used to prove. McAdams has found that the most psychologically resilient people tend to narrate their difficult experiences in a specific way, not as wounds that define them, and not as stories of triumph that deny the difficulty, but as events that were genuinely hard, and that also, over time, opened something. He calls this the redemptive narrative, not because it makes the suffering false, but because it finds some meaning in it that connects the difficulty to growth or understanding or a different kind of strength. The research consistently shows that people who narrate their lives with this kind of arc, not always, not without grief, but with some thread of meaning running through even the hardest chapters, show higher well-being and better psychological functioning. This does not mean manufacturing meaning where none exists, or denying the reality of what happened. It means remaining open to the possibility that the story is not finished, that the meaning of an experience is not fixed at the moment it happens, that the same event can carry a different weight at 50 than it did at 25, and a different weight again at 70. The story of who you are is still being written. The earlier chapters are not more authoritative simply because they came first. The narrative identity is not your biography. It is the interpretation you have placed over your biography. Two people who experienced the same sequence of events could carry radically different narrative identities, one organized around loss and survival, the other around resilience and unexpected grace. The events are the same. The stories are different. And the stories shape, in real and measurable ways, how each person moves through the next sequence of events. The person whose story is primarily one of resilience expects, at some level, that difficulty will eventually pass, and that something useful will emerge from it. That expectation is not naive optimism. It is the stored emotional residue of a story that has, so far, tended to move in that direction. It becomes a self-fulfilling frame, not because positive thinking makes good things happen, but because the frame shapes attention, and attention shapes which possibilities a person notices and pursues. Target 1,500 plus words. In 1968, a psychologist named Walter Mischel published a book called Personality and Assessment that caused something like a crisis in the field he was working in. Mischel had done something that felt almost cruel in its simplicity. He had looked at the research on personality and asked whether people's trait descriptions actually predicted their behavior. Not in questionnaires, in real situations. If a person is described by themselves and others as honest, do they actually behave more honestly across the situations of their life? If someone is described as aggressive, are they actually more aggressive across different contexts? If someone is rated as conscientious, do they actually show up reliably across different kinds of tasks and demands? Answer, Mischel found, was discouraging. The correlations between trait ratings and specific behavioral observations were surprisingly low. The consistency that people perceived in one another and in themselves was, Mischel argued, at least partly an illusion. People were not nearly as consistent as their trait descriptions implied. They behaved one way at home and another way at work. They were aggressive in some contexts and compliant in others. The situation, Mischel argued, was doing more work than the trait. This became known as the person-situation debate, and it consumed personality psychology for roughly a decade. The situationist position, that behavior is primarily a function of the situation, not the person, had a long pedigree. It was compatible with the behaviorism that had dominated psychology for much of the mid-20th century. And Miss Jell's data seemed to support it in ways that couldn't be easily dismissed. But the resolution, when it came, was more nuanced than either side initially claimed. The problem was not that personality doesn't exist or doesn't matter. The problem was that researchers had been looking for the wrong kind of consistency. If you measure someone's behavior on a single occasion in a single situation, the predictive value of their trait rating is indeed modest. But if you aggregate behavior across many occasions and many situations, if you average across a week, a month, a year, the consistency becomes much more visible. People are consistent, but not in a rigid, moment-to-moment way. They are consistent in the way that weather is consistent, not in the sense that today will be exactly like yesterday, but in the sense that over many days, a pattern becomes visible. You can't predict with confidence that an extrovert will be outgoing at this particular dinner party tonight, but across 50 dinner parties and 50 workdays and 50 phone calls, the extrovert will have reliably behaved more socially than the introvert. The signal is real. It just requires time to see. What Miss Jell's critique did successfully establish is that situations matter enormously. People behave differently in different contexts, and this is not inconsistency or weakness. It is appropriate. A person who is warm and expansive at home and quieter, and more careful at work, is not being two-faced. They are responding appropriately to genuinely different social environments that call for genuinely different behavior. The person who is aggressive only when they feel threatened is responding to a real feature of the situation. Context is always shaping behavior, and pretending otherwise produces both bad science and bad understanding of other people. What the synthesis produced, and what most personality psychologists now work with, is called interactionism. The idea that behavior is always a product of both the person and the situation, and that understanding either alone gives you an incomplete picture. Traits tell you about the tendencies, the probability that a person will respond in certain ways, the direction in which they are disposed to move. Situations provide the opportunity, the provocation, the constraint. The behavior that emerges is the joint product of both. There's something about this that is directly relevant to how you think about yourself. You have probably noticed that you are not the same person in every situation, that the version of you that exists at work is somewhat different from the version that exists with your closest friends, which is somewhat different from the version that exists alone at 2 in the morning. This is not a sign that you don't have a consistent self. It is a sign that your consistent self is expressing itself appropriately, that your traits are interacting with different situations to produce different, but characteristic, behaviors. The version of you that is quiet and careful in a meeting with strangers, and warm and expansive at dinner with people you love, is not two different people. It is one person with a particular personality architecture, responding appropriately to genuinely different environments. The consistency is real. It runs underneath the variation, shaping which ways you bend in which circumstances. Pay attention to how you bend, and you'll see it. There is a particular implication of interactionism that is easy to miss. If behavior is always a joint product of the person and the situation, then part of understanding yourself is understanding which situations bring out which versions of you. Not in the sense of finding situations to avoid, though sometimes that is appropriate, but in the sense of understanding the environmental conditions under which your traits serve you well and the conditions under which they cost you. Someone high in conscientiousness functions beautifully in environments with clear goals, measurable progress, and reliable feedback. Those are the situations where their need for structure and completion becomes an asset. Put the same person in an environment that is chronically ambiguous, where the goals shift before any can be met, where progress is impossible to measure, and the same trait that was an asset becomes a liability. The conscientiousness keeps looking for a foothold that isn't there, keeps generating self-criticism for failing to organize something that was never organizable. The trait hasn't changed. The situation has. This is worth knowing because people often interpret their worst situational responses as evidence of their worst traits, as proof of something fundamentally flawed. The person who becomes withdrawn and defensive in certain family situations, who functions with calm competence in others. The variation is not inconsistency. It is the trait encountering different soil. Some environments are genuinely better matched to your personality architecture than others. The mismatches are not failures of character. They are environmental incompatibilities. One of the more useful things personality research can offer, practically, is the realization that some of the difficulty you experience in certain contexts is not about you lacking something, but about you being somewhere that doesn't fit you. That distinction matters. The solution to a poor fit is rarely to try harder. It is more often to find a different context, or to understand the mismatch clearly enough to compensate for it deliberately, knowing what you are compensating for and why. The self that shows up differently in different places is the same self. The context is just revealing different facets of the same structure. The way light at different angles reveals different textures in the same stone. There is a specific implication of the interactionist view that rarely gets stated directly. The situations you find yourself in repeatedly are not random. People with particular trait profiles tend to select into particular kinds of situations and tend to evoke particular responses from the people around them. The extrovert, by being warm and energetic, tends to draw more social invitations, which creates more social situations, which develops their extroversion further. The person high in neuroticism, by detecting threat more readily, may come across as defensive in situations that are actually neutral, which provokes more guarded responses from others, which produces more situations that feel threatening. The personality is not just responding to the environment. It is, over time, creating it. This is what behavioral geneticists call gene-environment correlation. The tendency for people's traits to be associated not just with how they respond to situations, but with which situations they encounter. Your personality is not a passive variable that exists separately from your life and then reacts to events. It is an active force in the construction of your circumstances. The choices you make, the relationships you pursue, the environments you select or avoid, all of these are shaped by your traits, which means that your traits are continuously shaping the raw material that then shapes your traits. The feedback loops run in both directions across an entire lifetime. Knowing this changes something about how you think about the recurring patterns in your life, the situations that keep repeating, the relationship dynamics, the professional circumstances, the social experiences that feel, in some deep way, familiar even when they are technically new. They are not just happening to you. You are, in part, generating them, not through any failure of intention or awareness, but through the cumulative directional force of a particular personality meeting a world of opportunities and constraints, and selecting repeatedly in characteristic ways. Target 1,500 plus words. The Big Five captures most of what varies between people in personality. But there are regions of human character that the 5 factors don't illuminate very well. The darker terrain, the traits that describe not just personality dimensions, but something closer to ways of treating other people. Psychologists have identified a cluster of traits that have come to be called the Dark Triad. The 3 traits that make it up are narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Each is distinct from the others, though they share a common core, a tendency to prioritize the self over others, to view people as instruments, to be willing to exploit or deceive or manipulate in pursuit of personal goals. Narcissism, in the clinical and research sense, is not simply vanity or self-confidence. It is a cluster of traits that includes an inflated sense of one's own importance, a deep need for admiration, a sense of entitlement, and a notable deficit in empathy. People high in narcissism tend to believe, genuinely, that they are special, more talented, more interesting, more deserving than other people. They tend to seek positions of attention and status, not merely because they enjoy them, but because they need them. What is less obvious about narcissism, and what the research consistently shows, is how fragile the grandiosity tends to be. The confidence that narcissism projects is often a surface covering a much more vulnerable core, one that reacts intensely to criticism, to being overlooked, to any evidence that the specialness is not recognized. Machiavellianism, named for the Renaissance political philosopher whose advice about power was famously calculating, is the tendency toward strategic, manipulative, cynical behavior in service of personal goals. People high in Machiavellianism tend to view others through a lens of utility, What can this person do for me? They are patient in their manipulation, willing to delay gratification, skilled at reading situations and calibrating their behavior accordingly. They tend to succeed in hierarchical environments where the rules are flexible and relationships are transactional. They are often genuinely charming, at least until the charm is no longer useful. Psychopathy in its research form, as distinct from the clinical diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, is a trait dimension characterized by low empathy, low anxiety, low impulse control, and high thrill-seeking. People high in psychopathy tend to experience other people's distress without the normal resonance that most people feel automatically. They don't mirror. When someone cries in front of them, something that should feel painful or uncomfortable simply doesn't, in the same way it does for most people. This is not chosen, any more than the extrovert chooses to find social situations energizing. It is a feature of how their nervous system processes social information. What makes the Dark Triad interesting in the context of personality research is not just that these traits exist and cause harm, they obviously do, but what the research says about how they are distributed. These are not rare conditions that afflict a small, identifiable group of people. They are dimensions. Everyone sits somewhere on each of these continuums. Most people are very low on all three. Some are moderate. A smaller number are high. The traits are heritable. They show up in twin studies, just as the big five traits do. They have evolutionary arguments for why they might have persisted. In certain environments and at certain frequencies, manipulative or low empathy strategies can produce reproductive and social success. What this means, practically, is that you have encountered people with elevated Dark Triad traits. Almost certainly. They are not rare enough that a lifetime of human contact could plausibly have avoided them. The research on how these traits manifest in workplaces, in relationships, in social groups is extensive and consistent. People high in narcissism tend to be rated as highly impressive in the first few meetings and progressively less impressive as the acquaintance deepens. People high in Machiavellianism tend to thrive in environments with opaque rules and visible hierarchy. People high in psychopathy tend to be skilled at appearing trustworthy precisely because they lack the normal anxious tells that accompany deception in most people. There's also a finding that researchers call subclinical psychopathy, a level of psychopathic traits that falls below any clinical threshold, but is still measurably elevated, still associated with reduced empathy and increased risk-taking. Research suggests that subclinical psychopathy is somewhat more common in certain high-status, high-stakes occupations. Surgeons, CEOs, lawyers, emergency responders, not because those occupations attract dangerous people, but because a somewhat reduced fear response and somewhat reduced empathic resonance can be genuine assets in situations that require calm, decisive action under conditions that would emotionally overwhelm most people. This is the uncomfortable double-sidedness of the dark traits. They cause real harm in many contexts. They also, in specific contexts, produce real advantages. The same reduction in anxiety that allows a person high in psychopathy to exploit others without remorse also allows them to make a calm incision in a crisis, to deliver a terminal diagnosis without falling apart, to walk into a burning building when everyone else is running out. The traits themselves are not uniformly bad, even as the behavior they produce very often is. It is worth dwelling on what this means for how you understand the people in your life who have caused you harm. The research on Dark Triad traits is not a license to write off or dismiss the people who have hurt you, but it does offer a frame that can, for some people, reduce a certain kind of persistent confusion. The confusion of asking why someone who seemed warm or impressive or attentive turned out, over time, to be consistently damaging. The research on narcissism is particularly clarifying in this regard. The early presentation of narcissism is often genuinely impressive. People high in narcissism tend to be rated as highly appealing in initial encounters. Confident, energetic, engaging, seemingly interested in you in a way that feels flattering. The grandiosity hasn't yet had time to land badly. The entitlement hasn't yet surfaced in a situation where it conflicts with your interests. The empathy deficit hasn't yet manifested in a moment when you needed something that a person with normal empathic resonance would have given automatically. The first impression is real. It is not a deliberate deception in most cases. It is the personality at its most appealing angle. The research finding that people rate narcissists as highly impressive in the first few meetings and progressively less impressive as the acquaintance deepens has a particular implication. If you have ever been drawn to someone who seemed exceptional, and then, over months or years, felt increasingly confused by the gap between the person you thought you were getting and the person you actually encountered, that gap is not a failure of your perception. It is the normal developmental arc of knowing someone high in narcissism. The early impression was accurate for that time period. The later disillusionment is accurate for a different, deeper level of acquaintance. The confusion is real, and it is understandable. The research just says, you are not wrong at either point. You are watching the same person express themselves differently as the relationship deepened and the stakes changed. Understanding the dark traits as traits, not as the full story of who someone is, not as evil in a simple sense, but as genuine dimensions of their personality that predict specific patterns of behavior, makes it possible to respond to those patterns more clearly, not with more forgiveness necessarily, or less, but with more precision about what you are actually dealing with, and what is likely to change, and what is not. There is one more thing the research on dark traits reveals that is worth carrying. These traits exist in everyone to some degree. Every person has some capacity for self-interest that overrides empathy under sufficient pressure. Every person has some capacity for manipulation in service of their goals, for strategic impression management, for treating another person as an instrument rather than an end. The Dark Triad doesn't describe a different kind of human being. It describes one end of dimensions that run through all of us. This is not a counsel of moral relativism. The person who is genuinely very high in psychopathy is not simply more of a spectrum. Degree matters enormously, but it is a reminder that the qualities you observe and find alarming in others are not alien to your own psychology. They are, in most people, genuinely rare and genuinely constrained, held in check by empathy, by social anxiety, by conscience. But they are there. Understanding their presence in the full range of human character, rather than projecting them exclusively onto a category of bad people, is one of the more honest things personality psychology can offer. Target 1,500 plus words. The Big Five emerged from Western research and was initially validated mostly on Western populations. As the field expanded and researchers began measuring personality across the world, in East Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in South America, in small-scale traditional societies, two things became clear simultaneously, and they appear contradictory until you understand them. The first thing is that the basic structure of personality, the five broad dimensions, appears to be universal, or nearly so. The same factors keep emerging from the data in populations with vastly different cultural contexts, which suggests that the Big Five is tracking something real about human nature, not just something culturally constructed in weird. Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic populations. The second thing is that where on these dimensions populations tend to cluster varies substantially across cultures. When you compare average trait scores across countries, and researchers have done this with samples from dozens of nations, you find real, consistent differences. East Asian populations tend to score lower on extroversion, on average, than North American or European populations. Some cultures show higher average levels of conscientiousness. Some show higher average neuroticism. These are not stereotypes being confirmed. They are measured differences in the central tendency of trait distributions, differences that show up across multiple studies with multiple samples. The causes of these cultural differences are genuinely difficult to untangle. Some of it is probably real genetic variation between populations with different demographic histories. Some of it is certainly cultural. Cultures that value restraint and interdependence, for example, may produce environments that shape personality in ways that reduce extroversion scores, or that create a different relationship to the kind of assertiveness and social seeking that extroversion measures capture. Some of it may be artifact. The way personality questionnaires translate across languages and cultural contexts is imperfect, And what looks like a difference in extroversion may sometimes be a difference in what the word outgoing means. One of the most consistent findings across cultures is a dimension that the Big Five doesn't capture very cleanly: interdependence versus independence. Western psychological theory has long assumed an individual self, a bounded, autonomous agent whose personality is fundamentally their own, separate from their relationships and social roles. But in many non-Western cultures, and in significant pockets of Western cultures, particularly among communities with recent immigration histories, the self is understood and experienced differently, not as a separate unit that relates to others, but as constituted through relationships. Identity is less about what you're like as an individual and more about what roles you occupy and how well you fulfill them. This is not a trivial difference in cultural attitude. The research suggests it reflects genuine differences in how the self is experienced, differences that show up in how memory works, in how emotion is regulated, in how success and failure are attributed. The independent self tends to take credit for success and externalize failure. The interdependent self does something closer to the reverse. Success is attributed to relationships and circumstances. Failure is more readily internalized. These are deep differences that don't reduce to any of the Big Five dimensions. What this means for understanding yourself is worth dwelling on. The framework through which you understand your own personality, the vocabulary of traits, the idea that you have a stable individual character that persists across situations, is not a neutral framework. It carries assumptions about what a self is, what individuality means, what consistency and authenticity amount to. These assumptions are not wrong exactly, but they are assumptions. They fit some experiences of being a person better than others. If you grew up in a household where identity was understood primarily through relationships and roles, as a child, as a sibling, as a member of a community, then the Western personality framework may feel like it captures something true about you, but misses something equally true. The part of you that changes substantially depending on who you're with, that feels less like one person and more like a collection of roles. That is not inconsistency. In some frameworks, it is just what a self is. Personality science has made enormous progress in the last 50 years. It has also, in that progress, sometimes mistaken the Western individual for the universal human. The field has been working to correct this. The corrections are ongoing. What they have produced, so far, is not a rejection of the Big Five, but a deepening of the picture, a recognition that the structure is real and the dimensions are universal, but that where people sit on those dimensions and what those positions mean in the context of a life is always also a cultural story. This has particular relevance if you grew up in a household that operated with a different model of selfhood than the one the standard personality frameworks assume. Many immigrant families, many communities of faith, many non-Western cultural contexts operate with an understanding of identity that is fundamentally relational, in which who you are is not something you carry independent of your relationships and roles, but something that is constituted through them. In that understanding, asking, "What are you like?" is a strange question, because the answer is always, "It depends on who I am with and in what capacity." Research comparing self-ratings in individualist and collectivist cultures consistently finds that people in collectivist cultural contexts tend to rate themselves as more variable across situations than people in individualist contexts. They are more likely to note that they are different at home and at work, different with parents than with friends, different in a formal setting than in an informal one. This is not inconsistency by their own accounting. It is appropriate responsiveness to different relational contexts, which are, in their framework, constitutive of identity rather than merely occasions for its expression. The way you understand your own personality, whether you experience it as something you carry or something that is built between you and the people around you, is itself shaped by the cultural framework you were raised inside. And that framework is not neutral. It is one among many possible frameworks, each of which captures something true about the experience of being a person, and each of which also has blind spots. What the broadening of personality research across cultures has produced, ultimately, is not a single unified theory that explains everyone. It has produced a more honest recognition of how much of what we think we know about personality was derived from a particular slice of human experience. The structure is real and probably universal. The meaning of the structure, in the context of a specific life, in a specific culture, in a specific relationship, that is always more particular than any framework can fully contain. There is a specific experience that many people have when they encounter personality frameworks for the first time, a sense of recognition that is also a sense of relief. The questionnaire score that comes back and names a thing you have always noticed about yourself, but struggled to articulate. The dimension that explains, with clinical precision, why certain situations have always felt like effort when they seem to come easily to others. That recognition is real, and it is valuable. It says, this thing you have been living inside is real. It has a structure. Other people have experienced something like it. It is not just you. What the cross-cultural research adds to that recognition is a kind of caution, a reminder that the categories are useful tools, not natural kinds. The 5 dimensions are real and heritable and cross-cultural, but the interpretation of where you fall on each of them and what that means for who you are and what you should do is culturally mediated in ways that the clean numbers on a questionnaire don't show. A score of 75th percentile on introversion means something different in a culture that values social withdrawal as wisdom than in a culture that treats it as a social deficiency. The trait is the same. The meaning is constructed. Holding both of these things, the genuine reality of personality structure and the constructed nature of its meaning is, perhaps, the most honest position. You are, in some real and measurable sense, a particular kind of person. And the meaning of that, what it says about how you should live and what you should value, is something you are still working out. Both things can be true. The personality science doesn't tell you what your traits mean for your life. It tells you what your traits are with some precision and gives you a language for the things you already knew about yourself, but may not have had words for. What you do with that knowledge, how you carry it, how you work with the traits you have rather than the ones you might prefer, that remains entirely yours to figure out. The science describes the structure. The living is something different altogether. Target 1,500 plus words. One of the most consistent findings in the personality and relationships literature is one that people recognize immediately and find slightly disquieting. People tend to be attracted to people similar to themselves, not identical, and not in every dimension equally, but across the research assortative mating, the tendency for people to form partnerships with others who are similar to them in personality, values, intelligence, and attitudes, is one of the most robust patterns in the study of human pair bonding. Conscientious people tend to partner with conscientious people. Open people tend to partner with open people. This is not universal and not inevitable, but it is statistically reliable across many studies and many cultures. Why does this happen? Part of it is simply opportunity. People who share values and interests tend to frequent the same places and pursue the same activities, so they encounter each other more often. Part of it is the comfort of similarity. Being with someone who experiences the world in roughly the same way reduces friction, requires less negotiation, produces a kind of ease that dissimilarity tends not to. Part of it is that similarity is read as validation. When someone who approaches the world the way you do chooses you, it confirms something about your way of approaching the world. The exception that researchers consistently find is agreeableness and neuroticism. People do not consistently pair with others at the same level of these traits. In fact, there is some evidence that neuroticism has a complicated relationship with relationship quality. High neuroticism in one partner tends to predict relationship dissatisfaction, regardless of the other partner's neuroticism level, which means that, for some people, the experience of relationships is genuinely more difficult. Not because they are doing something wrong, but because their nervous systems produce a more reactive, more threat-sensitive experience of close proximity to another person. The research on how personality interacts with relationship satisfaction shows something consistent. There is no trait profile that guarantees relationship success, and no profile that makes it impossible. But some traits make certain aspects of relationships easier or harder in predictable ways. High conscientiousness in both partners tends to predict better relationship functioning. Both people follow through on commitments, both people manage conflict in organized rather than chaotic ways. High agreeableness tends to predict reduced conflict, though it can also predict conflict avoidance that allows problems to fester. High openness tends to predict relational richness, but also sometimes a kind of restlessness that makes sustained commitment harder to sustain. The research on personality and relationships also shows, across many studies, is that people tend to play particular roles in relationships that are consistent with their trait profiles, and that these roles are often not consciously chosen. Someone high in agreeableness may find themselves, again and again, being the person who accommodates, who gives ground, who smooths things over. Someone high in conscientiousness may find themselves organizing, planning, tracking, holding systems together. Someone high in neuroticism may find themselves in the role of the person who sounds the alarm, who notices the threat before others do, who carries a disproportionate share of a relationship's anxiety. These roles are not problems, exactly. They are what the personality produces when it meets another person's personality in close proximity. But they can become problems when they are rigid, when the accommodating person cannot say what they need, or when the alarming person cannot find a moment of rest, or when the organizing person cannot tolerate the chaos that the other person's spontaneity creates. There's a finding that has emerged from long-term relationship research that is worth knowing. The personality traits that attract partners to each other at the beginning of a relationship are often, years later, among the traits that produce friction. The partner who seemed spontaneous and exciting at 25 seems unreliable and disorganized at 35. The partner who seemed stable and reliable at 25 seems rigid and risk-averse at 35. What was appealing in one phase of a relationship is the same quality, unchanged, that becomes a source of complaint in another phase. This is not hypocrisy or fickleness. It is something about how personality traits land differently depending on the context, the stressors, the evolving demands of a shared life. The trait itself has not changed. What has changed is the environment in which it is expressing, and the accumulated weight of 10 years of the same expression. Understanding this doesn't dissolve the friction, but it does, sometimes, make it more possible to see the person you're frustrated with as not having done something to you, as not having concealed something or failed at something, but as being, in a situation that has evolved, the same person they always were. The research on personality and relationship satisfaction contains one more finding that is difficult to sit with, but important. The traits that predict the highest relationship satisfaction when measured in the short term are not the same traits that predict satisfaction over long periods. Early relationship satisfaction is strongly predicted by high extroversion. The energetic, warm, outgoing presentation that characterizes the early stages of a good match. Long-term relationship satisfaction, measured across decades, is more strongly predicted by low neuroticism in both partners than by any other single trait variable, which means that the most sustainable romantic partnerships, the ones that remain satisfying across 20 or 30 years, are built not primarily on attraction, not primarily on shared interests or even shared values, but on emotional stability, on the capacity to return again and again to a relatively regulated state, to not carry grievances past their natural lifespan, to navigate the ordinary frustrations of shared life without chronic emotional escalation. This is not a romantic finding. It is a useful one. The research says, in effect, that the traits that are most glamorous in a partner, the passion, the intensity, the highs that come with someone who experiences the world very vividly, are often the same traits that make the long middle of a life together harder, and the traits that are least visible in early attraction. The steadiness, the reliability, the quiet emotional regulation that makes someone easy to live with are the ones that compound over time into something that sustains. There's also a finding about personality similarity in long-term partnerships that is less about attraction and more about function. Partners who are similar in conscientiousness tend to argue less about the practical management of shared life, about cleanliness, about money, about planning and follow-through. Partners who differ significantly in conscientiousness, one highly organized and one chronically spontaneous, tend to experience chronic friction in exactly those domains. Friction that feels personal, but is, in a significant sense, just two differently calibrated systems trying to share the same household. The friction of personality mismatches is real. It does not mean the partnership is wrong or that it cannot work. It means that some of the difficulty of living alongside another person is not about failure of love or failure of effort, but about the structural realities of two specific nervous systems in close proximity, each one doing what it is built to do. Research on long-term partnerships also consistently finds that the capacity to accept, not just tolerate, but genuinely accept, the parts of a partner that are not going to change is one of the most important predictors of sustained relationship quality. This is not resignation. It is something closer to accuracy. The person who spends the first decade of a marriage trying to make their introverted partner more social, or their spontaneous partner more organized, or their anxious partner more calm and failing, because those traits are genuinely heritable and stable, is in a different relationship than the person who eventually stops trying to fix the trait and starts working with it, adapting around it, finding ways to meet what the trait produces without requiring the trait to disappear. That shift from fixing to adapting is sometimes the most important thing that happens in a long partnership, not because fixing is wrong to attempt, but because the personality research says clearly that the thing you are trying to fix is not going to go away. Your partner is going to be recognizably the same person in 30 years that they are now. The question is not how to change the trait. It is how to build a life that works with it. There's something in the long literature on personality and relationships that is quietly hopeful if you look at it from the right angle. The finding that personality is moderately heritable and substantially stable is sometimes experienced as fatalistic, as evidence that who you are is fixed, that the difficult aspects are permanent, that the patterns are locked. But for relationships, the same stability that can feel like a trap is also a form of reliability. The person who is consistently warm is going to keep being warm. The person who is consistently thoughtful is going to keep being thoughtful. The traits that drew you to someone, the ones that are genuinely good, are also heritable and stable. They are not going to disappear either. The stability cuts both ways. Target 1,500 plus words. There is a version of self-knowledge that psychologists have been quietly undermining for decades. And it is the version that most people assume they have. The version is this: through introspection, through paying attention to your own thoughts, feelings, motivations, and reactions, you can come to know yourself accurately. You can understand why you feel what you feel, why you do, what you actually want, who you actually are. The examined life is available to you through the act of examining. The research does not support this version, not because introspection is useless, but because the access it provides is far more limited than people assume. Much of what drives behavior, the underlying motivations, the automatic evaluations, the implicit associations that shape how you respond to situations before you've had a chance to think about them, is not available to conscious inspection. It runs below the surface. When you introspect, you are not looking into a transparent system. You are constructing an explanation. You are telling yourself a story about why you did what you did, and the story has some relationship to the truth, but is not the same as the truth. This has been demonstrated in dozens of clever experiments. People who are induced to feel good in ways they don't know about by holding a pencil in their teeth, which activates the muscles of smiling, being put in a clean-smelling room rather than an odorous one, by meeting an experimenter who is warm rather than cold. These people then make more positive judgments in unrelated domains. And when asked why they made the judgments they made, they confabulate. They produce explanations that have nothing to do with the pencil, or the smell, or the experimenter's warmth. The explanations feel true. They are sincerely believed. They are simply wrong. The psychologist Timothy Wilson, who has spent a career studying what he calls the adaptive unconscious, argues that the gap between what we know about ourselves and what is actually driving our behavior is vast and largely invisible. The conscious self is not the driver. It is more like a passenger who has been told a plausible story about where the car is going and why. This might seem like a reason to give up on self-knowledge, but Wilson and other researchers in this tradition make a different point. You can know yourself, but you have to look in the right places. The right places are not your introspective reports about your own motivations. They are your behavior over time. your choices, your patterns, your reactions, your history. The self that can be reliably known is the self that shows up repeatedly in what you do, not the self that you construct when asked to explain yourself. The specific mechanism of confabulation, the way the mind generates confident but inaccurate explanations for its own behavior, has been documented in some of the most striking experiments in cognitive science. Patients with severed corpus callosums, where the two hemispheres of the brain operate essentially independently, will perform an action directed by the right hemisphere, and then, when asked why they did it, produce a smooth and confident explanation from the left hemisphere that has no access to the actual reason. The explanation is not recognized as a guess. It is experienced as a memory. It has the same phenomenology as genuine self-knowledge, and it is wrong. The same mechanism operates in people with intact neurology under normal conditions. It is not a pathology. It is how the explanation-generating system normally works, quickly, fluently, confidently, and with only partial access to the actual causes of the behavior it is explaining. The fluency is convincing. It convinces the person producing the explanation as much as anyone else. This is an uncomfortable reversal. Most people experience their inner life, their thoughts, intentions, feelings, reasons, as the most real version of themselves, and their behavior as a secondary expression of it. The research suggests something closer to the opposite. The behavior, across situations and time, is the more reliable data. The inner narrative is the more constructed thing. Wilson's research and the broader tradition of unconscious cognition research suggests that the reasons you give for your choices are often post hoc. They are generated after the decision has been made by a part of the mind that is very skilled at producing plausible explanations and very poorly positioned to observe the actual process that produced the choice. The explanation feels true. It has the texture of an actual memory, an actual deliberation, but it is, frequently, a confabulation. Not a lie exactly, not an intentional misrepresentation. It is what the explanation-generating system produces when it looks at what you did and works backward to a reason. What this implies, practically, is that the most useful self-knowledge comes not from sitting quietly with your thoughts and examining your intentions, but from watching yourself over time, from noticing patterns across situations, not in an anxious or self-critical way, but with the same curiosity you might bring to studying any interesting phenomenon. What situations consistently bring out your best responses? What situations consistently produce your worst? What kinds of people tend to reliably energize you? And what kinds tend to reliably drain you? What decisions do you keep making that you later regret? And what do those decisions have in common? The answers to those questions, accumulated over years of observation, are more accurate than any amount of introspection about your deeper nature, because they are based on what you actually do, not on what you construct when asked to explain yourself. Other people, as uncomfortable as this is, often see parts of this pattern before you do. The friend who has watched you make the same kind of choice in relationships 5 times, and who has gently said something about it that you found annoying, may be seeing something real that your self-theory has organized away from view. The colleague who has worked with you long enough to know exactly how you respond under pressure, and who could predict your reaction to a difficult email before you receive it. They have data. It is uncomfortable data from the inside because it suggests a predictability that doesn't feel like freedom. But it is also, in a certain way, a form of being deeply known, of someone having paid enough attention to who you actually are to be able to see you clearly. Other people often have access to this more accurate self before you do. Studies have found that, for some traits, particularly extroversion and conscientiousness, close others who know you well are actually better predictors of your future behavior than you are yourself, because they are watching what you do over time without the distorting lens of your own theory of yourself. Your self-theory protects you. It keeps the story coherent. It manages the anxiety of self-contradiction, but it also systematically distorts what you can see. What would it mean to take this seriously? Not to abandon introspection. It is still useful, still worth doing, still sometimes the only path to what you need to understand, but to hold it more lightly, to be more curious about the gap between what you think you're like and what you actually do, to notice, without too much defensiveness, when your behavior in a situation surprised you, when you reacted more strongly or more weakly or differently than you would have predicted. Those gaps are data. They are the places where the real architecture shows through. The personality science described across this evening points towards something that is not nihilistic, but is genuinely humbling. You are a person with a relatively stable set of traits, somewhere between 40 and 60% of which were shaped by genetics before any experience you've had could touch them. Those traits interact with the situations you find yourself in to produce behavior that is consistent enough to be predicted, but variable enough to consistently surprise you. You carry a narrative about who you are, and where you came from that is partly true, partly construction, partly a function of how you have interpreted events rather than what the events actually were. Other people carry a different version of you that is also partly true and partly wrong. And underneath all of this, a vast amount of processing is happening that you have essentially no direct access to. This is the person you are at 2 in the morning. This is the person you are at any moment. Partially known, partially constructed, partially given to you before you had any say in the matter. It is more mysterious than the version most people carry of themselves. And it is also, perhaps, more interesting. There is something that happens when you stop requiring yourself to be fully explained, fully consistent, fully knowable. The self becomes less like a thesis you are defending and more like a country you are exploring. One where the map is incomplete and some regions are genuinely unmapped, and where the fact that you don't know everything about it is not a failure, but simply the condition of being here. 500 words. Tonight you walked through some of what science has found when it turned its instruments on the question of who you are. You are, in part, the result of genetics you did not choose, a set of traits that were distributed to you in a lottery held before any memory you have, that show up in your nervous system as tendencies, as dispositions, as the particular directions you lean when the situation is neutral. Those tendencies are real. They are yours, and they were, to a significant degree, always going to be yours. You are also the result of experiences you have interpreted and reinterpreted across the years of your life, accumulated into a story that feels like simply knowing yourself. That story is not false, but it is also not the whole truth. It is the best account you have been able to construct from a position that doesn't have full access to the thing it is describing. You are a person who behaves consistently enough across the situations of your life that other people recognize you, that you are, for them, a person with a character, a way of being. And you are also a person who behaves differently in different situations in ways that are appropriate, that are responses to real differences in what each situation calls for. All of these things are true at the same time, without contradiction. You are stable and changing. You are partly determined and partly open. You are the same person across time and genuinely different at different points in your life. The science does not resolve these tensions into a neat answer, because there is no neat answer. There is just the person, all the layers of them, the heritable and the assembled, and the narrated and the situational, making their way through a world that keeps presenting new circumstances. The part of you that has been awake tonight, receiving these ideas, the part that finds some of this familiar and some of it strange, that recognized something in the description of the person who can't quite sit still with themselves, or in the description of the way we carry self-defining memories like photographs that keep being repainted. That part of you is the same part that will fall asleep now. It will keep doing its work while you sleep. Some version of what you heard tonight will move through the processing that happens in the hours between now and morning. And when you wake, you will be the same person you were when you started, mostly within the arc, with the same tendencies that have always been yours. That is enough to know. Let it all go now. The question of who you are can wait until morning. There is nothing you need to understand or resolve before you sleep. The person you are is already here, has always been here, doesn't need to be figured out tonight. Just rest